Evolution of Populations, Part 3, 7.2, Part 3 to be exact. All right, let's look at some variation. Variation. We're looking at different traits exist within a given species or a population. So you can see here that there's all kinds of, we're still talking humans, but look at all the variety that exists. And it's that variation that's the key to surviving in a changing environment. It's because we have options. And so we've talked about it over and over, how it provides the opportunity to be able to survive and reproduce. And so it's the options that are the raw building materials for evolution to utilize. So in order to, it's those different changes, not the different changes, the differences that allow evolution to take place. So if there was no variation or no options from which to utilize in order to draw from, then a species is confined to only what's available. So if there are no options of more melanin in the skin, then you're not going to have a higher incidence of survival in the sun. I mean, you're not going to have that because you don't have that variation. If everyone had the same amount of melanin, then you're not going to have any difference in the amount of survival. And so that species would be confined to what's available if there were not options, even if it's weak or unfavorable, like I just said. I mean, if having really pale skin, not a lot of melanin to protect you from the sun, that's not a favorable trait. So variation on the most very basic level is only going to come into existence when you have some sort of change in the DNA nucleotide sequence. That's referred to as a mutation, or like I said before, or if you're looking at if a different part of the DNA is now expressed. And so some mutations are favorable, but most of them are harmful. So what we know is that variation exists between individuals and populations unless the population is composed of clones, which of course would be asexual reproduction. But otherwise, you're going to see this variation that is going to exist. And so creating this variation for evolution to build upon, if we look at the variation being created through the process of mutations. So the changes for these are very rare and very random in the gametes, in the sex cells, because the cells are normally not exposed to the environmental stresses that an organism may encounter in their existence. So it mainly normally occurs in the somatic cells. In the body cells is where the mutations occur, because those are exposed to environmental stresses. If I'm going to have mutations in my skin cells because I'm exposed to the sun, that's not going to affect my egg cells. And so, but the sun damage is going to affect my somatic cells, my skin cells. And so, so we're not going to see these mutations because my skin cells are not, the genetic information for those are not being passed along. So most mutations, unfortunately, are harmful to the cell or to the organism. And so most of the mutations usually, they usually die out. Now, if we're talking about variation in sexual reproduction, so the first one was through mutation, but we obviously have a lot of variation that occurs through sexual reproduction. And this process here of crossover that we looked at during meiosis, here's where those chromatids cross over right here. And so we mix that genetic information, that we swap the genes from one chromosome to another, and it's equal mate over here, usually during that gamete formation. So this is so that each sperm or egg is unique in its genetic composition. So we're not just replicating these, now we're swapping over this information. So we end up with, you can see we end up with the changes along here. These are the same, these chromatids are the same here, but these are the recombinant ones. They've been recombined with the genetic information. All right, now this variation, when we talk about this segregation, it means separation. So the segregation of these chromosomes during anaphase 1 and 2 of meiosis. So it reduces that genetic content number. Remember, we're going in a reduction. So we're going from 46 chromosomes down to 23. And so this is found within a sperm or egg. And then eventually we end up with haploid cells. So normally we're looking at diploid. Now we're looking at, through the process of meiosis, we end up with haploid cells, or that N number, the ploidy number N, instead of 2N for diploid. All right. Now, and again, you can see, so here we have these pulling apart in anaphase 2, and now we end up with these haploid chromatids here. We can also have the random and the other reason why within sexual reproduction we have variation in crossing over, but we also have this very random, extremely random, completely random fertilization that we know of. Okay, so we say completely random, but you know, I mean, is it? I don't know. I mean, that's what we believe right now. It is random fertilization of the sperm by an egg, and it creates this variety. So the egg that's released each month for the woman, the one that's going to get fertilized, is just random that the egg leaves, whichever, there's not a set pattern. And then with billions of sperm, which one of these is going to be the one that is going to fertilize that egg? And so each sperm and each egg are completely different. So when you have egg and the sperm coming together, they're going to be different too. All right, now there's two other concepts related to this evolution. So we talk about variety and then creating that variety, but we want to talk about this concept of microevolution. Micro, of course, meaning small. So this is evolution that occurs on a small scale. And this term usually refers to changes in that allele frequency. Remember Hardy-Weinberg. So we're talking about the changes in the allele frequency within the population of that species. Now, we could look at microevolution eventually leading to macroevolution. Macroevolution being the evolution of some completely new species or higher taxon in the classification system from some other pre-existing species. And so these little shift in the allele frequency, and we saw that in Hardy-Weinberg, you know, for all kinds of different reasons, and that could eventually lead to this a much larger scale macroevolution. Now, keep in mind, change over time is referred to as evolution. We're talking about change over time. Evolution is a scientific law. The environment changes from minute to minute, hour to hour, hour to hour, day to day, just as a genome may. I mean, it's just going to change over time. This is not, I just want to drive this point home, this is not talking about the origin of man. We're not talking about keep those concepts separate, because we see the observable, measurable, and testable changes. We see that occur in microevolution. We see the shifts in the allele frequencies. We're not talking about the origin of man concept. They're two different concepts, and they get confused a lot because we refer to evolution. There is that reference to evolution as encompassing that, but keep those concepts completely separate, because well, they're not completely separate. I mean, somewhere along the line, you know, there's going to be something that fits in there, but it's not observable, measurable, or testable. And so we're not talking about that. We're talking about what we can observe, measure, and test. Now, going back to natural selection, and looking at that, natural selection always has a positive effect on variation, because remember, nature favors those traits that make a population or species more able to survive in an environment and increase its ability to reproduce, and that keeps the species viable. So natural selection, when we're looking at that, it's a positive, it's some positive trait that allows that species to survive and reproduce. The weak traits eventually perish over time. Not weak individuals. I mean, we could think of a lot of weaknesses that we in our human mind would think are weaknesses, but that's not necessarily the case. We're talking about the weak traits. So if having red hair is not a positive, then we're going to see that shift out of the population. If if we're seeing, that people under 5 feet are not in some way, somehow that becomes weak, we would see that move out. If a insect that had longer wings, if that was a hindrance to them, we would see that because they would not survive to reproduce. And so we would see that those alleles move out of that population. We'd see a change. All right. Golly, I hate that our show has to end for today, but we must end. Have a fabulous evening.